the typical US driver, I mentioned about 40 hours. It's 42 hours lost due to traffic congestion in 2023. And that equates to a little more than $700 in lost time. So, and again, depending on where you are, if some areas are very high in household income, that time lost may be a lot more for that area versus others. So this is an average.
Well, first of all, I want to start by talking broadly, um, kind of from the 30,000 foot altitude level. How bad is traffic congestion in the United States right now?
Yeah. So the typical American driver spends about 40 hours lost to traffic in 2023. So, I mean, about a week's worth of work, plus or minus, but that's obviously depending on where you are, it could be more. So New York is, drivers in New York are more than 100 hours versus some smaller towns where people aren't losing that much time to congestion. So I think it really matters where you are in the country, in the world, and whatever, is going on locally. Now, that being said, in about half of the cities we measured, traffic is worse than 2019 pre-COVID times. In the other half, it is not. So really, again, traffic congestion is building, but depending on where you are, that may look different.
Okay. Now, I know that part of the kind of rebound in traffic congestion is probably just coming out of the pandemic, but are there other factors that your research pointed to that could indicate other causes for the increase in congestion?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, throughout COVID, there have been, for example, more online deliveries. So that has generated some trips, commercial trips. And that requires more freight, more trucking, those types of things. Um, Additionally, what we've been seeing though is there is a lot of trip demand in the middle of the day. So people are either adding new trips to their, daily travel schedule. They're continuing to drop kids off at school. They're continuing to go to the store in the middle of the day, whatever it may be. We are seeing quite a bit of activity throughout the midday, a little bit less activity in the morning commute. So, kind of the convergence of hybrid work, more trips being made in the middle of the day leads to, a little bit more congestion, especially as it heads into the evening peak period.
You had mentioned a lot of this depends on where you are. So I'm kind of curious, in terms of the United States, what are the worst areas that you found for traffic congestion?
Yeah, no surprise, it's the New York area. Chicago also ranks pretty high, LA, Seattle, uh, Boston. So those very one thing kind of in common, not completely throughout all of those, is the fact that telecommuting was big, especially on the coast. Well, that has it pared back a little bit. People started commuting into the office more. And so those areas that had more telecommuting likely saw more people hitting the road, in 2023. The other thing is, though, is almost all of those, probably with the exception of Los Angeles, has a very job dense downtown. So Manhattan has a large share of the New York region's jobs. Downtown Boston has a large percentage, downtown Seattle, etc. Versus like a Dallas or a Houston, where they only have a single digit percentage of the region's jobs, which in short, jobs are more dispersed in some areas and more heavily concentrated in others, like New York. And what we're seeing is those heavily concentrated in downtown are still seeing quite a bit of congestion.
Is this simply a matter that the more densely populated an urban area is, the more likely we are to have that congestion?
Yeah, but so it's been found that in general, density results in people traveling shorter distances, right? And so that would reduce the amount of driving or walking, versus a longer distance. Sorry, I meant in terms of distance for walking. More people walk in dense areas, but um, however, let's say if driving was cut by a third, but you double the people, you still end up with more traffic congestion because of that increase in density is greater than the loss in travel. So yes, you tend to see that. Also, road space is a little bit more at a premium in dense areas, so you don't see as much road expansion. The cost of right of way and construction in dense urban areas is a lot more costly than, say, in rural areas where land is much less expensive. So all that infrastructure too, when you get into, really dense cities, costs a lot more. So it tends to play catch up a little bit more as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the effect on individuals. How much time on average is each individual driver losing each year to traffic congestion? And how much is that costing them financially?
Yeah, so the typical US driver, I mentioned about 40 hours. It's 42 hours lost due to traffic congestion in 2023. And that equates to a little more than $700 in lost time. So, and again, depending on where you are, if some areas are very high in household income, that time lost may be a lot more for that area versus others. So this is an average. But across the country, sorry, that it's an average that we think is pretty conservative considering how much we assign to each hour. But across the US, that's more than $70 billion in lost time due to traffic congestion. So it's a sizable amount. It increases. That doesn't even include the increase to the cost of goods from trucking delays and delivery delays and all of that. So we feel that that 70 billion is really a conservative number and it's likely to be much higher.
You mentioned one of the things that's kind of a trend is things are kind of moving out because areas outside of downtowns tend to have cheaper land. And in some areas, suburbs are developing farther and farther from urban cores. I've read quite a bit about what they call edge cities, where you have these large office areas way out in the suburbs. To what extent does the amount of time spent in traffic congestion represent those greater distances to those edge cities or those office areas in suburban land?
Yeah.
Or is there increased driving distance at all because of that?
Yeah, you've kind of got an interesting scenario there. On one hand, we see this in West Coast cities and some East Coast cities. They actually have urban growth boundaries which don't allow development outside of a boundary. You typically see this in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, um, and those areas have bad traffic. So, I mean, with all of that growth concentrated in one area, again in Seattle, like in the Seattle example or San Francisco, you've got a high percentage of people commuting to downtown in a very dense urban area. You're going to see lots of traffic. In some areas where they don't have those boundaries, let's say Houston, the the travel patterns are far more dispersed and more akin to like throwing pickup sticks on a map. They kind of go everywhere. So sometimes these edge cities, they may actually go against traffic because they're heading out of the main city, and actually creating an employment base and destination, out there. So that may actually work to reduce congestion a little bit, at least for the drivers that are traveling that route, versus going into the city. So you kind of see there's a double-edged sword there.
Okay. Um, you had talked a little bit earlier about the fact that we're seeing more midday traffic, that it's not just simply the traditional rush hours of morning and evening. Is that really the only time of day you're seeing kind of a variation from that traditional rush hour, or are there other times of day where congestion is cranking up that really don't fit the traditional pattern?
Well, so congestion is cranking up during that midday period, which then, if not alleviated, continues on into that evening peak and can make congestion more severe at that typical 5 o'clock rush hour because the traffic hadn't had a chance to abate yet or to reduce before hitting another peak. But actually, there's a switch in the other direction. We're seeing far fewer trips being made in the morning. And so while the morning peak is still kind of there, I mean, people are still experiencing traffic congestion on their way to work, on their way to school. Um, there's less of it in general in the morning. So we've sort of seen travel in that morning commute kind of shift more to 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, which kind of again indicates more of a hybrid work scenario. People making, you know, quote, discretionary trips. So trips to laundromats and stores and gas stations. Um, and so those are all likely combining to increase the number of trips being made during the middle of the day.
Okay. One of the other things I was looking through the study results that they talked about in there, that you talked about in there, I should say, is the level of congestion on different days of the week. Now, obviously, you would expect weekends to be lighter and weekdays to be worse, but were there individual weekdays when congestion was worse, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, so we took a look at trips to downtown specifically. You know, there's been a lot of discussion in the news about downtowns and their revitalization after COVID. Some downtowns have seen a lot of growth. We've seen like downtown Nashville, Miami has a lot, you know, has had a very big tourism season. So we see some downtowns in general, ones with a little bit more nightlife. Um, the highest percentage of trips throughout the week is actually made on Friday. Now that's commuting trips, that's recreational trips, that's going out to dinner trips. And so at least to downtowns, Friday, just by a percentage point, is a lot higher than the next day, Thursday. Um, but again, some downtowns have tended to struggle. San Francisco's downtown has struggled a bit. Seattle has had some issues with it. You can kind of see it in the property values of these commercial buildings. You know, they're down pretty significantly due to it largely due to the fact that, you know, fewer people are coming downtown. So some downtowns have fared a lot differently than others. And I think that that's the main takeaway from this study is that it really matters where you are. I mean, downtown New York is a different beast than downtown Detroit, Dallas, Omaha, Nebraska. It really just depends on where you are. And what you're seeing may look very similar to pre-COVID times, or it may look a lot different. You may be seeing congestion at different times of the day. Downtown may look a little bit different. And so that's the main takeaway from this report.
I know that you focused mainly on urban highways, obviously, because that's where the greatest congestion is and the greatest density that affects that. But obviously, for our audience, which is made up of commercial truck drivers, the rural highways are also very important. And I've been reading about more states that are increasing the capacity of roads in rural areas. And a good example is right outside our building here, Interstate 70 in Missouri, Kansas City to St. Louis. They're looking at expanding that to 3 lanes each direction, which currently is only the case within the urban areas on either side of the state. Um, so I'm wondering, did you take a look at the rural roads in addition to the urban areas, and what sort of things did you find there in terms of the level of congestion?
We include rural roads in our calculation. Again, this is a commuting scorecard, so it's a little bit different. It tends not I mean, we looked at 295 cities in the US. So it does pick up, big cities and smaller cities. And so there it will likely pick up, a lot of those rural roads. What I will say though is, yeah, those rural roads are the key to moving stuff all over the country. And I know, even in my backyard, we're building new interchanges, new overpasses, but it is more on the rural side, versus the, as soon as you get into a city, those freeway to freeway connections. Actually, even out where there aren't huge cities, even those freeway to freeway interchanges were just simply not built to modern traffic levels. And so you tend to see bottlenecks even on rural roads where key interchanges exist because, maybe they're just one lane, or they just can't simply handle the level of traffic that they were designed for. And so while our scorecard does take that into account, to a certain level, it doesn't address the congestion problem directly for those rural highways. But we know that there are, huge demands being made on those rural highways to get goods to and from port, to get, agriculture moving, to connect up to, rail facilities and things like that. So, that is a topic that we're continuing to look at because of its importance to the economy of the country.
I want to kind of run a scenario by you here, and I didn't see that you really broke out the level of congestion caused by commercial traffic as opposed to just passenger vehicles. But over the past couple of decades, there's been significant changes in trucking regulation, and one of the effects of that is kind of twofold. First of all, you have a lot greater concentration of truckers driving during the day. You have a lot fewer driving at night when maybe they traditionally before that would have driven. But the other thing is that due to the changes in the hours of service regulations, we've heard anecdotally from a lot of truckers that in the past they might have waited out rush hour, just taken a quick rest period and waited for rush hour to clear and then gone through metros. And now, due to the way the regulations are configured, they don't feel they have that choice anymore. They just go ahead and go through. Did you see any patterns in commercial traffic that are contributing to this congestion? And did you look into whether those are some of the causes, or are there other causes that you saw?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think I haven't, we did not for this study, but I mean that's a very interesting take, right? Because I mean you can definitely see how that affects congestion, right? I mean, there are a lot of places in urban areas too where you increase the number of trucks on on a decent grade or a hill, and there's need for hill climbing lanes and all of that kind of stuff because of that exact issue that you're talking about, with more trucks, for lack of a better term, being forced to
Yeah.
to travel at certain times. That's definitely going to exacerbate um congestion. And so, and our infrastructure hasn't adapted to that, um, or if it can. So, that's an excellent point. I haven't looked into that cause directly. Generally, we're looking at recurring congestion, simple, general travel demand exceeding the road capacity of freeways and arterials and city streets. But obviously, that's a good point that you brought up as a reason why there is congestion. There's also road incidents and, which cause a ton of congestion depending on where you are. Weather definitely plays a factor. Traffic signal timing plays a factor. When you get into the city, managing the curb. So for those kind of last mile deliveries, that's curb allocation and how cities are going about that could be an issue, whether you're dropping off people or goods or performing services. That can definitely lead to increases in congestion as well. So While there are a lot of causes, that one I wouldn't be surprised if that also contributes to traffic congestion a bit.
Um, Something else that I've been reading about over the past couple of years, and again, I didn't see that you covered this in your report, but I'm curious if you have looked into it or if this is something that you're considering looking into, and that is solving congestion. The traditional idea, and again, looking at Interstate 70 right outside the building where I am, is you just add more capacity, but there's some people, and especially at the federal level, who have said that basically no matter how much capacity you build, it just seems that the traffic grows to fill it. Is this something, a problem that government can build their way out of, or is that assumption that some have made that adding capacity doesn't really help? Is that true? What's kind of your view on that?
Well, I think it's clear. I think it has to be delineated a little bit. So adding more lanes accommodates more traffic, that people, cars, foot traffic, traffic in that sense of the word. But it doesn't necessarily mean more traffic congestion. And that's what we're, really trying to focus on here is congestion, not just traffic, right? So a grocery store. Foot traffic is a good thing if you own a retail store. So traffic is good. People standing in lines for 30 minutes to get their goods, not good. That causes people to leave. So we're really focused on the congestion part of it. And I think in some areas, yeah, I mean, building lanes works to accommodate the increase in traffic. And I think it does in a lot of other areas. But as mentioned before, I don't know if you could really eliminate or solve congestion or that we'd want to, because it would just be so costly. I mean, adding a whole new freeway in New York probably would be in the tens of billions of dollars, if not more. So it's really, are the costs worth, the benefits? Does that, and a lot of times it's, like I said, fixing those freeway to freeway interchanges, kind of freeing up those classic bottlenecks. I think strategically adding capacity in a lot of these places that are kind of resistant to adding capacity because they think it leads to sprawl and bad for the environment and what have you. But strategically adding capacity, and like I mentioned before, like maybe a hill climbing lane here. I can think of one at home that is notorious that, truckers take, which they have to, and it's kind of the road is under capacity and you have, pretty decent hills to climb. Well, that to me just seems, right for a hill climbing lane or an auxiliary lane here. We're not talking about a lot of mileage. So I think that is a strategy. Also, involving involving other parties too. So involving the private sector a bit more. We see a lot of that in Texas, some in California, some in other states, about public-private partnerships. And, that it's a mixed bag depending on which group you talk to, whether they like them or they don't like them. But that's another avenue to go through to get some of this infrastructure built. We see, some freeways being built that way, the Port of Miami tunnel, bringing in these financing mechanisms can help get some infrastructure built.
Okay. Well, that's all I have, Bob. I'm curious, are there other figures from your study that stand out to you or anything else that you want to add to what we've talked about?
Well, no, I since, this is, a commercial podcast, truckers listen to this. Yeah, this did not take into the account the cost of goods being delivered late, all of that stuff, which we know just increases prices at the grocery store, increases the cost of goods across the board. And so it's, while I say that's $70 billion, the price is likely much higher when you consider the delays to goods and services being moved around this country. So, and sitting in queues at ports and, all of the fun stuff, trying to find truck parking. all of that stuff are big issues that you know, definitely need some attention.
Very cool. Well, thank you very much for your time and for all the information. Very enjoyable conversation, and appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.